A while back, I wanted to make a video explaining what I think is the missing link in competitive Overwatch, specifically focusing on the structural issues of the Overwatch League and why its attempt to replicate the more successful model of traditional sports leagues like the NHL hasn't worked out for it. To do that, I was going to go over the basic structure of the Overwatch League and its path to pro to make the case for what I consider to be the missing link in the whole competitive scene. And I'm still hoping I'll be able to do that video at some point after this one. Honestly, I didn't even really think the path to pro would be that hard to explain. Like, it's just Contenders, Collegiate, and Open Division. How hard could that be? Turns out, very hard, because Contenders is truly the worst organized tournament series / competitive league that I have ever encountered in my life. Like, I grew up playing hockey at a lot of different levels and going to tournaments on a pretty regular basis, and while there were definitely sometimes some overcomplicated tournament structures or poorly planned events, I have never seen anything as poorly planned and poorly communicated as Overwatch's path to pro. It's not just hard to follow for someone who might be a prospective fan, but also just not fair for players or really organizations. If you're wondering why almost none of the academy teams still exist today, it's probably because they realize that this isn't a viable model given the costs and inconsistent returns on them. I am convinced that whoever's responsible for Contenders actively wants the Overwatch League to fail and is acting as a saboteur from the inside, because the alternative to that is that Blizzard genuinely thinks that this is a good way to engage audiences and build a legitimate, serious path to pro. Before we start with the actual topic, I want to explain why I think this is an issue worth addressing in a bit of a part zero. When it comes to a traditional sport like hockey, there is no equivalent to the developer of an esport. There is no company that invented hockey, holds the game under copyright, or anything like that. If the existing hockey leagues are bad, someone can start a new one, poach the talent, and replace them. There was no entity that could unilaterally impose the National Hockey League, or NHL, onto Canadian and American hockey. It had to build its way there and knock out competitors to become the top league. A badly run hockey league is still screwing over its players and teams, 100%, but there's at least theoretically the potential for an alternative, and while there's only one top league in North American hockey, there are dozens of lower circuits that operate with varying levels of integration to the NHL in terms of things like players on two-way contracts, and varying levels of audience, varying levels of success. That can't happen in Overwatch. Activision Blizzard owns the rights and has pretty aggressively taken control over how competitive Overwatch is going to be allowed to run. It happens through their tournaments and their leagues. If you want to play Overwatch as an esport, you've got to play ball with Blizzard. If their leagues are going to be poorly organized and poorly run, there isn't an alternative. There isn't allowed to be a competitor to the Overwatch League, and so both the pros and hopeful pros are locked into Blizzard's system. There are still external tournaments that happen occasionally, like independent tournaments going on, but the actual pro scene of Overwatch is firmly in the hands of Blizzard, and frankly, it shows. I want to make it clear up front that part of why Contenders makes me so frustrated is because this is genuinely unfair to the people who have no choice but to try and navigate this ridiculous system to try and have a career. If Blizzard is going to demand total control over their competitive ecosystem like this and their professional ecosystem like this, they have an obligation to the players who are forced to go through it to handle it well. If you're watching this and you are a Contenders player or participated in Open Division or have just generally been involved in this process at some point, I want to make it clear this video isn't dunking on you or anything. It is not the fault of the participants that the system is bad, and I genuinely think you guys deserve a lot better than this. Lower circuits are integral to any competitive ecosystem, and you guys would have a lot more fans and a lot more opportunities to build your standing and career if you were being given a fair opportunity to do so. In traditional sports, plenty of lower circuit leagues thrive because they're able to develop and flourish and attract fans. In Overwatch, nobody knows what the hell is going on with the lower circuits because they're so poorly built that I don't think anyone really could follow it unless they made it their full-time job. Blizzard's incompetence makes this whole system inaccessible to potential audience members and honestly probably pretty inscrutable for talent scouts as well, which would kind of undermine its whole purpose as a path to pro. With that out of the way, let's start with the basics. Part 1. How does the path to pro work? Off the bat, I want to say that I'm not going to be concerning myself with the Overwatch Collegiate circuit. That is its own separate beast, and frankly this video is already going to be too long, and it also isn't directly integrated into the Overwatch League the way the rest of the path to pro is. The parts that I'm going to be focusing on are the Open Division, the Trials, and the Contenders, which, very oversimplified, work as follows. Open Division leagues are regional leagues that are open to anyone who wants to enter a team. This is the entryway into the path to pro, with the top teams in the Open Division getting invited into trials. The structure and purpose of the Open Division has changed a lot over the years, and we will get into that, but for now all you need to know is that the Open Division is generally open to anyone, and the teams in the circuit are generally competing for cash prizes, albeit small ones, and invitations to trials. Contenders Trials, which I'm just going to call Trials for simplicity, is the purgatory between Open Division and Contenders. It's not really a league of its own in the way that both Open Division and Contenders mostly are, but more of a qualifier tournament for Contenders itself. The lowest placing teams from the past Contenders tournament or season will go against the highest placing teams from the past Open Division season in their region, with the top teams from Trials qualifying for the next Contenders tournament, and the lowest placing teams having to play in the next Open Division to see if they can earn their place back. This tournament generally doesn't come with prize money, unlike both Open Division and Contenders. Lastly, Contenders. If the Overwatch League has minor leagues, it's Contenders. The top teams from previous Contender seasons will be invited back for the next one generally alongside the top teams from the last Trials tournament. Teams and Contenders are competing for invites to the next season and prize money, with top teams from Contenders generally qualifying for the next season of Contenders and the bottom teams getting bumped back down to Trials. Importantly, the way that this generally works is that you can only move up or down one tier at a time. You can't get knocked straight from Contenders into Open Division for the most part, and you can't qualify for Contenders straight out of Open Division. Each part of the path to Pro, as well as each season for each part, also bleeds into the others really heavily. The slate is never wiped clean. How you ended your last season is going to influence how you start the next one, and a team can spend years competing in Contenders without ever having to face the Trials or the Open Division again if they just keep placing high in Contenders. Teams can also change ownership or decline their invitation for a later series for any number of reasons, and some teams just cease to exist, sometimes in the middle of seasons. There are also Academy teams, which are teams that have existing relationships with the Overwatch League teams. For example, Uprising Academy is the Academy team for Boston Uprising. We'll talk more about that later. Speaking of, the way the seasons work is complicated. They don't go straight numerically from the first season to the current season, rather they're numbered based on their year. So in 2017 there was a Season 0 and a Season 1. In 2018 there were Seasons 1, 2, and 3. In 2019 there were Seasons 1 and 2, plus international tournaments like Pacific Showdown, Atlantic Showdown, and the Gauntlet. In 2020 there were Seasons 1 and 2 plus the Gauntlet, although this is a different Gauntlet, which we'll get into that later. In 2021 there were Seasons 1, 2, and 3, and in 2022 they set the whole thing on fire and did something entirely different, and they've just also announced their plans for 2023, but we'll get there when we get there. Each season is also region specific, and not only do the regions change, each region also handles its structure differently, sometimes even within the same season as other regions. In 2017, there were two regions, North America and Europe. In 2018, the regions were North America, South America, Australia, China, Europe, Korea, and Pacific. In 2019, the regions were North America East, North America West, South America, Australia, China, Europe, Korea, and Pacific for Seasons 1 and 2, with regions being merged together into Atlantic and Pacific for international stuff. In 2020, the regions were North America, South America, Australia, China, Europe, Korea, and Pacific for Season 1, with Pacific being dropped for Season 2, and then the gauntlet further slimming down to just North America, South America, Asia, and Europe. In 2021, it was slimmed down again to North America, Australia, China, Europe, and Korea for Seasons 1 and 2, and then only North America and Europe had a Season 3. In 2022, like I mentioned, they set everything on fire and it's miserable, and we will get there when we get there, but in general, the regions for 2022 were North America, Australia, China, Europe, and Korea. In 2023, the regions are being shifted pretty dramatically. North America and EMEA, or Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, are both in the West region, while Korea, Southeast Asia, East Asia, and Australia/New Zealand will be the East region. Southeast Asia and East Asia are also sometimes collectively bundled together as APAC, or Asia Pacific. Lastly, for the basics, there are a bunch of different types of tournament structure that the Path to Pro uses that will be referenced throughout this video, so I'm just going to try and quickly define those here. First up is Round Robin. Round Robin tournaments are a non-elimination tournament format where every team will play every other team once, with teams being awarded points based on their performance that will determine their final placements. There's also a variation on this called a double Round Robin, which just means everyone plays each other twice instead of playing each other once. Next, we've got Swiss style. Swiss style tournaments are similar to round robins in the sense that it's a non-elimination system, but the main difference is that teams don't play every other team in a Swiss style tournament. Instead, teams play a predetermined number of matches against other teams. The rules for how teams are paired up can get complicated, since teams can't be paired up twice in a single tournament, and organizers need to have a way to ensure that nobody gets an unfair advantage by only being placed against teams that they're way better than. Next, we have single elimination tournaments, which just involve all teams being placed in a tournament bracket with winning teams moving on to the next stage and losing teams being eliminated from the tournament. Then we have double elimination. In a double elimination tournament, there are functionally two tournament brackets, a winner's bracket and a loser's bracket. Typically, all teams will start in the winner's bracket, although some double elimination tournaments start with the lowest seeded teams in the loser's bracket. If a team loses in the winner's bracket, then they're sent down to the loser's bracket. If a team loses in the loser's bracket, then they're eliminated from the tournament altogether. Usually, the championship in a double elimination tournament will be played between the top teams from each bracket. Lastly, we have King of the Hill. The two lowest seeded teams will face off against each other, with the winner advancing to face off against the next lowest seeded team, and so on and so forth until they eventually reach the top seeded team, who is the King of the Hill. Last term I'm going to define for this section is group stages. For some tournaments, instead of all participants facing off against all other participants, the teams are broken up into multiple groups that they'll compete in. For example, in some trials tournaments, instead of 8 teams playing a single round robin tournament, they'll be split into 2 groups of 4 teams, and each group will play a single round robin with each other. In any instances where I mention a group stage, it'll usually involve all the teams involved being split into 2 equally sized groups unless I specify otherwise. Again, I really need to emphasize that all of this is legitimately the extremely oversimplified description of how Contenders works, and I kind of need you to understand that this is part of the problem. This is ridiculous. No wonder nobody follows Contenders. It's an inscrutable mess of overlapping leagues and tournaments with no consistency from year to year, season to season, or region to region. With that, it might be a good time to move on to part 2. How Contenders has worked in the past. You'll notice that when I was describing how Open Division, Trials, and Contenders work earlier, I kept it very light on details in terms of how they actually work. You might be thinking, like, hey Vivros, what does it mean when you say that the top teams from the Open Division qualify for Trials? Or like, hey Vivros, what kind of tournament structure is Contenders using? And the answer to both of those questions is that there are no more consistent characteristics of them across regions and across seasons. The prizes, the number of participating teams, the requirements to qualify for various levels of competition, the frequency of competitions, the style of tournament, the regions running Contenders seasons, all of that and more is up for elimination at the start of each year. Sometimes even in the middle of a year. This section is going to go over how each past season of Contenders worked, including regional variations for all seasons from 2017 to 2022 to try and explain just how inconsistent the path to pro has been. In 2017, Contenders ran its first two seasons, Season 0 and Season 1. Season 0 was meant to be a bit of a setup for the concept, so it's understandable that its structure was a bit unique. In 2017, only the European and North American regions were in operation, and the way it worked was that they ran 2 open qualifier tournaments, with the top 8 from each moving on to group stages. From there, the top 16 teams competed in group stages in a double round-robin format, with the top 2 teams from each group moving on to a single elimination playoff. Each of these seasons had a $50,000 prize pool, and the top 8 teams in Europe also automatically qualified for 2017 Season 1 Europe. Top 6 teams in North America also automatically qualified, with the other 2 spots being taken up by Envious and Rogue because of their performance in another series. In 2017 Season 1, only the 8 teams who qualified from Season 0 competed, with the regular season being a round-robin tournament followed by a single elimination tournament for the playoffs between the top 4 for a $100,000 play pool. In 2017, there wasn't like a standardized Open Division or Trials the way there would be in future seasons, just the Contenders level and an open qualifier tournament for it. That changed in 2018, which is the year where Contenders began to take its full form. The number of regions expanded from 2 to 7, with leagues being open for South America, Australia, China, Korea, and the Pacific. Every region except for China began their season with an Open Division Swiss-style tournament, culminating in the top 16 moving on to a double elimination-style playoff for the Open Division. From there, a varying number of top teams moved on to the 8-team Trials tournament. In North America, it was only the top 6 from Open Division, with the other 2 spots being taken by the bottom 2 teams from the NA 2017 Season 1, while the top 8 in Europe, Pacific, South America, and Australia all moved on to Trials. In Korea, the top 2 teams advanced, and in China they didn't have Open Division, so it was all based on external tournaments. The top 2 teams from NA, the top 4 from SA and Korea, the top 5 from Australia and China, and the top 6 from EU and Pacific all moved on to their respective 2018 Contenders Season 1, which each had 12 teams. The remaining teams in each tournament were invited from other tournaments, such as 2017 Season 1 in NA and EU, as well as Academy teams, which were a new feature of Contenders for 2018. Academy teams did not have to earn a spot in the 2018 Season 1 Contenders, and constituted 7 of the NA teams, 1 of the Chinese teams, and 1 of the EU teams. The regular Contenders season consisted of a group stage of 2 teams of 6 in a round robin, with the top 4 teams from each group advancing to playoffs. Playoffs in each region were 8-team single elimination tournaments, with all 8 playoff teams being invited to compete in Contender Season 2 for their region. Season 2 and 3 were both a lot more straightforward. The top 4 teams from each Open Division league advanced to Trials, and in Trials, the bottom 4 teams from the most recent Contenders season would go against the top 4 from the most recent Open Division. The top 4 from Trials would move on to Contenders, to go against the top 8 from the last Contenders season, and all tournaments across all regions kept this structure. In 2019, Contenders expanded again to 8 by splitting North America region into North America East and North America West, although this only affected the Contenders level. Open Division and Trials were both NA-wide, with qualifying teams for Contenders being split up after they qualified. Starting with 2018 Season 1, in NA, the top 6 teams from Open Division moved on to Trials, while it was the top 4 in China, top 2 in SA, Australia, Korea, and Pacific, and the sole top team in EU. Trials remained an 8-team round-robin tournament, and in NA, the top 5 teams from Trials advanced to Contenders, while it was the top 2 Trials teams in all other regions. For 2019, the Contenders League was shrunk to only 8 teams from the previous 12, with the exception of China, where it stayed at 12. And once again, Academy teams got an automatic invitation to Season 1 Contenders, constituting 5 teams in NA East, 4 in NA West, 4 in China, 2 in EU, and 1 in Korea. The remaining slots were filled by the highest placing non-Academy teams from 2018 Season 3 in their respective regions. In China, they continued the 2018 format of a group stage round-robin tournament with the top 4 from each group advancing to a single elimination 8-team playoff tournament, while the other regions ran 8-team round-robin tournaments with the top 6 qualifying for single elimination playoffs and the top 2 teams getting byes to the semifinals. For 2019 Season 2, things were pretty similar to Season 1. Each region, plus a combined NA, ran Open Division tournaments with the top 4 teams qualifying for Trials. In NA, the bottom 2 teams from 2019 NA Season 1 contenders in each region were sent back to trials to compete in an 8-team round robin, while China also ran an 8-team round robin, including the bottom 4 from 2019 China Season 1 contenders. In all other regions, trials dropped to a 6-team round robin, with the bottom 2 from 2019 Season 1 contenders and the top 4 from the 2019 Season 2 Open Division. In China, the top 4 advanced to contenders, while the top 6 in NA advanced and then were split 3-3 between East and West, with the remaining regions only advancing their top 2 from trials into contenders. 2019 Contenders Season 2 ran the same way in each region as it had in Season 1 and was followed up by the Gauntlet. 2019 also featured 2 rounds of international tournaments. The first were the Atlantic and Pacific Showdowns. The Atlantic Showdown was between the champions in NA East, NA West, SA, and EU, while the second place EU team also got an invite, and the second place teams in both NA regions played each other for a 6th spot. And the Pacific Showdown was between the champions in Korea, China, Pacific, and Australia, with the second place teams from Korea and China also getting invites. Aside from the prize pools, teams were also competing to see how many invites their region would get in the Gauntlet, which would take place after Season 2 this year. The winning teams in the showdowns were from NA for the Atlantic and Korea for the Pacific, granting 1 extra regional invite to each, and the bottom 2 teams were SA and EU for Atlantic and China and Australia for Pacific, giving each of them 1 less regional invite. As a result, the Gauntlet had 4 NA teams, 3 Korean teams, and 1 team each from China, Pacific, and EU, facing off in a double elimination tournament, with no teams from SA or Australia. In 2020, the Path to Pro got a massive overhaul, so instead of just explaining each season, I'm going to go through the overall structure. For one, no more NA East and West. They're back to just NA, bringing the region count back down to 7. However, the much bigger change is that they've totally reworked how the Open Division, Trials, and Contenders work. In the past, each season had begun with an Open Division, followed by Trials, followed by Contenders, and then starting over again for the next season. In 2020, seasons would instead kick off with Round 1 of an Open Division Swiss-style league, with the top teams advancing into Week 1 of Trials for a 12-team, single-elimination tournament. The top 8 teams from Week 1 of Trials advanced to Week 1 of Contenders, while the bottom 4 advanced to Week 2 of Trials. Contenders tournaments were also 12-team single-elimination tournaments, and not only were teams playing to qualify in future weeks, they were also playing for playoff points. The top team in a Contenders week would get 100 points, second would get 50, third and fourth would get 35, 5th through 8th would get 20, and 9th through 12th would get 10. The top 4 teams would also qualify for Week 2 of Contenders, while the bottom 8 would go back down to Week 2 of Trials. In Week 2 of Trials, the top 8 would once again advance to Contenders, but the bottom 4 would get sent back to Round 2 of Open Division, where they would have to earn their way back into the tournament. Academy teams were immune from this, though. If an Academy team's placement would warrant being knocked back to Open Division, they would instead get a bye to Week 3 of Trials. Week 2 of Contenders had the same setup as Week 1 of Contenders, and Round 2 of Open Division functioned the same as the first round. Week 3 of Trials functioned the same way as Week 1 of Trials and was followed by Week 3 of Contenders, which also kept the same structure from past weeks. Week 4 of Trials was the final week of the season, so instead of the bottom 4 getting pushed to future Trials, they would instead go back to the Open Division for the next season. After Week 4 of Contenders, the total points for all teams, regardless of how many Contenders tournaments they qualified for, would be added up, with the top 8 teams in points advancing to playoffs. Playoffs would be a double elimination tournament, seeded based off of the points each team brought into the playoffs. At the end of Season 1, the top 4 teams from the Season 1 playoffs were invited to Week 1 of Contenders in Season 2, with the bottom 8 teams from Season 1 being invited to Week 1 of Trials in Season 2. In between the seasons, the Pacific region was also dropped, bringing it down to just 6 regions for Season 2. After Season 2, there was another Gauntlet, although with a totally different structure. It ran for 4 regions, NA, SA, Asia, and EU, with 12 teams in NA, 8 teams in SA, 10 in Asia, and 12 in EU. Each Gauntlet ran a qualifier tournament. In NA, SA, and EU, they ran similarly to the Open Division, with the top 4 teams moving on to the Gauntlet, with Asia running an open qualifier tournament followed by a closed qualifier tournament between the top 4 open qualifier teams and the 3rd through 10th place teams in the 2020 Contenders Korea Season 2, with the top 2 from that advancing to the Asia Gauntlet. Each Gauntlet ran a little bit differently, but that's the general structure of them. And then, in 2021, they threw all of that away. For one, they cut out South America, leaving us with just 5 regions: NA, EU, China, Korea, and Australia. For another, the point system is now gone, and we're back to a more normal-ish tournament structure. In 2021, every region except for Australia and Korea ran a standard Open Division to kick off Season 1. Australia skipped Open Division altogether and just went to a shortened Trials, while Korea ran 3 Open Division tournaments, one for Japan, one for Korea, and one for high school teams in the region to enter. Trials in 2021 Season 1 were all over the place. In NA and EU, the top 4 of 6 teams advanced. In Australia and China, the top 2 of 4 advanced, and in Korea, the top 2 of 10 advanced. Contenders itself was also very weird. In NA and EU, they just ran 2 double elimination tournaments with the same 8 teams. In Australia, they ran a round-robin tournament with 6 teams, followed by double elimination playoffs with the top 4. In China, they ran 2 mini-seasons with the same 8 teams, starting with a round-robin tournament between all teams, followed by playoffs between the top 4 based on points in each. In Korea, they had 10 teams split into 2 groups that played round-robin tournaments, with the top 4 from each group advancing to a seeding tournament where they'd play a match against the other team from the other group with the same rank, with the winner getting the higher seed of the two and the loser of the 7th seed tiebreaker being eliminated. Then, the final 7 would advance to a King of the Hill tournament. For 2021 Season 2, they basically replicated the same structure, although this time Korea ran a more typical Open Division tournament and Australia ran 2 Open Division tournaments, with 1 winner from each advancing to Australian trials. As well, in 2021, China, Australia, and Korea only ran 2 seasons each, while EU and NA both got 3rd seasons using the same format they'd used before. And now you might be thinking, like, okay, there can't be any other league formats that they could try at this point, right? And you, my friend, are about to have a stroke over what happened in 2022. For one, everything we've discussed already is gone. Though everything we've talked about in the garbage, that's not really happening anymore. Everything is different and frankly stupid. First up, instead of the Open Division trials and contenders setup repeating in each season the way it has in the past, what we have instead is Summer Series A-sides, Summer Series B-sides, and Run It Back. The Summer Series A-sides were also called the Winter Series A-sides in Australia, but the B-sides stayed as Summer Series. Weird, whatever, I don't care. A-sides began with a qualifier in all regions, although some regions also ran single elimination open divisions to get into their qualifiers. In NA, the top 32 teams from their open division got early registration for a 64-team tournament. In China, the top 32 teams from the Open Division also got early registration, but it was only a 55-team tournament for some reason. In Australia, it was only the top 32 teams from Open Division competing. In EU, the top 8 teams from 2021 EU Season 3 were invited as early seeds, and another 32 teams from their Open Division got early registration for a 64-team tournament. And in Korea, they ran a 40-team tournament with the top 32 teams from their Open tournament getting early registration after the top teams from 2021 Korea Season 2 were invited as top seeds. Regardless of what process they used, each qualifier led to the A-sides main event, which was an 8-team double elimination tournament in each region. B-sides, though, were handled a little bit differently. In NA, the bottom 8 teams from the A-sides qualifier were invited to compete in another qualifier, with the top 4 moving on to face 8 teams from the 2021 NA Season 3 in the main event. From there, all 12 played in a round robin to determine the top 8, who then participated in a double elimination playoff bracket. In Australia, they just ran a second double elimination tournament with the same teams as the A-sides. In China, the bottom 4 teams from the A-sides main event and the bottom 6 from the A-sides qualifier were invited to the main event for B-sides for another double elimination tournament. In EU, they didn't have a qualifier, but they did follow a similar format to NA. The top 8 2021 EU Season 3 teams plus the top 4 A-sides teams did a round robin, with the top 8 teams moving on to a double elimination playoff tournament. In Korea, they ran a 12-team double elimination closed qualifier between the bottom 4 from the A-sides main event plus the teams who placed 9th through 16th from the final round of the A-sides main event to determine their top 4 teams, who then advanced to the group stage against the top 4 teams from the A-sides main event, with the top 3 teams from each group advancing to a double elimination playoff series. This was kinda inexplicably followed up by the Shimada Showdown, a tournament which only happened in Australia featuring the top 8 Summer Series B-sides teams plus the top 8 from a second round of Open Division. There was a single round of single elimination to whittle them down to 8, followed by double elimination for the rest of the tournament. Finally, we have the Run It Back tournaments, which were run in all 5 regions. NA and EU invited the top 8 B-sides teams and the top 4 from Open Division, ran a round robin for the top 8, and then went double elimination from there. Australia was the same, except with 8 Open Division teams instead of 4, no round robin, and a single elimination round followed by a double elimination for the rest of the tournament. In China, they ran an Open Division, with the top 2 going on to face off against the bottom 2 teams from the B-sides, and then the top 2 from that going on to join the top 6 from B-sides for a group stage where the top 2 from each group advanced into a double elimination playoff. Korea ran an open tournament with the top 4 advancing to qualifiers against the bottom 4 B-sides teams, with the top 4 from that advancing to Run It Back against the top 4 from B-sides. They ran a round robin to find their top 6, who moved on to a single elimination playoff bracket. Last but not least for 2022 was the Pacific Showdown, where the top teams from a bunch of other open tournaments fought it out in a single elimination qualifier to secure a single spot in the double elimination Pacific Showdown against the top teams from Run It Back China, Korea, and Australia. Contenders 2023 has not started yet, but it will include new regions as well as no more China for obvious reasons, and will be the first season where Contenders teams will also be competing in the Overwatch League. They've just announced the schedule for that, but tournament details are still a little unclear as of time of writing, and I don't want to speak on those seasons if I don't know what will be happening. Plus, frankly, this video is already stupidly long, so I'm just going to save you the time. Instead, now that we've broken down all 5 years of Contenders that have happened so far, let's move on to part 3. Why is this bad? This video wasn't really about making a bigger point so much as it was one just born out of frustration. I had to do the research for this, and as I was researching it, I just got more and more frustrated with how bizarrely and inconsistently this was being run. The way that everything to do with Contenders has been organized has been really inconsistent, really poorly done, and honestly kind of unfair. There are a lot of other factors influencing why Contenders hasn't worked the way that I think they wanted it to, but I would argue that the inconsistency is probably its biggest strike against it. In any given year, players and teams are both being yanked around by different demands on their time, different criteria for receiving rewards, different rewards in a lot of cases, and unfair requirements for progression in the leagues. The slate is never wiped, so a successful team is positioned to continue succeeding even if it might become a little bit weaker, while a strong new independent team has to overcome way larger hurdles to have a shot, and academy teams were just given straight up advantages. Contenders was supposed to be part of a path to pro that anyone could enter and ride all the way to the top if they were good enough, but all this inconsistency really meant that it was only an option for the people who were already on the precipice of becoming a pro, and had the resources to support that career. Instead of being a pathway to pro, Contenders is more like the driveway to pro. There's a limited capacity, it's only for people who already belong there, and the owners get priority. Despite how Blizzard pitched it, this isn't a structure built for people who aren't already at the top. The inconsistency of Contenders also meant that their ability to garner a consistent audience was pretty low. It's hard to get attached to teams when they constantly change and where a couple bad matches might lead to them being knocked out of the league. It's possible to become a fan of an Overwatch League team because the teams are constants in the league, even if they don't all qualify for every tournament or playoffs or whatever. It's a lot harder to do that with Contenders teams because there's no guarantee that a team will stick around at the Contenders level, and even if they do, Contenders plays pretty infrequently, all things considered. It also just generally made it hard to keep track of the stakes of a given match, especially if someone is trying to keep up with multiple regions at once. In one region, their contenders might be running a round robin, but another might be running a single elimination tournament in the same season at the same stage of the season. It's one thing to have a relatively complicated competitive structure, but if you're going to do that, you need to also be willing to explain it to people, and Blizzard has done a really bad job at that. With Contenders, it doesn't matter how closely you followed it in the previous season because the whole structure can be turned on its head at the drop of a hat. Like, no matter how closely you followed NA Contenders in 2019, you'll still have to relearn everything to follow along with NA Contenders in 2020. And that's not even considering how it changes between regions. Someone who's familiar with NA Contenders won't necessarily know how Korean Contenders works or be able to keep up with it, and this wouldn't be as much of an issue if the Overwatch League wasn't a global league, especially when academy teams were way more prevalent and you'd sometimes have an NA Overwatch League team fielding a Korean academy team. Altogether, the inconsistency makes it really hard for people to be fans of the league, and I need to stress that that is not an inevitability of it being a lower circuit. Lots of lower circuits in like baseball, hockey, and football have sizable audiences. It is a specific failure of the Contenders model, and I do legitimately think a lot of it just comes down to the inconsistency. The reality is that Contenders is supposed to be the path to pro for the average person. There is no alternative outside of the collegiate circuit, and even then, that's still pretty limited. It was meant to function as the developmental league for the Overwatch League through the academy teams as well as allowing independent teams to compete with them, and if it had been run competently, maybe that would have happened. Over the course of Contenders' lifespan, 17 of the 20 current Overwatch League teams have formed an academy team. However, as of March 2023, there's only one left that hasn't announced either a hiatus or a dissolution, and that's the San Francisco Shock's O2 Blast. Everyone else has ended their partnerships with their academy teams, either fully dissolving them or just cutting them loose and letting them operate as independent teams like any other. Without the pull of the academy teams, Contenders is even more likely now than ever before to struggle to bring in new viewers, which also makes it less appealing for more serious players, who are probably genuinely better served by either taking up a different game or just focusing on making money from streaming. Contenders has been run so poorly that not only was it set up to fail at its intended purposes, but it also managed to undermine teams, players, and potential audiences that might have flourished if the scene was being run by somebody competent. Given that Blizzard gave themselves a pretty functional monopoly over the competitive scene for this game, the blame for this inadequacy falls squarely on them. They don't know how to run this shit, and it's screwed over the players, the fans, and just the overall competitive scene for Overwatch, and that sucks. And that's gonna be the end of this rant. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed listening to me spiral over Contenders. I initially actually only planned to touch on Contenders briefly in the video that I was making about the Overwatch League's problems, but I was struggling to find information on how Contenders actually worked so that I could explain its role in the Overwatch League and the overall scene to a typical viewer. Eventually it got to a point where I had to dive so deep and explain so much that I realized that this needed to just be its whole own separate video, so that the actual video I wanted to make would be, like, digestible at a bare minimum. Now, instead of having to try and explain this organizational abomination in that video, I can just refer people to this one. Be sure to like, subscribe, turn on notifications, all that other good stuff. I've also just launched channel memberships, so if you'd like to get to vote on future video topics, get some special emotes, or any of that other good stuff, be sure to check that out by clicking the join button below this video. As well, I'd love to hear from you in the comments if you have any thoughts about the topic, especially if you follow Contenders or have followed it in the past, you know. Does this sound inaccessible to you too? Does it sound inconsistent? Or did you have a pretty easy time following it and didn't really connect with what I was saying here? If you're looking for more from me, YouTube's about to recommend a video from this channel, and I'm going to personally recommend the recent video that I did covering the study I conducted into the Dunning-Kruger effect in Overwatch. Both of those should be appearing in just a second. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.